Hello everyone. So today's topic is complication of chronic suppurative otitis media. Now we need to understand that these complications that we are going to talk about that occur in CSOM can also occur in acute suppurative otitis media, that is ASOM, and acute necrotizing otitis media, that is ANOM. So let's start with the causes that lead to a complication. So it can be a preformed pathway, means either through the oval window or the round window or through the lateral semicircular canal. There are preformed pathways connecting middle ear to the inner ear. So this can lead to a complication of inner ear. The other reason can be a trauma that leads to a pathway that can spread the infection from middle ear. Now these preformed pathway are generally seen in case of ASOM. Okay, now let's talk about bone erosion. We have already talked about it. The bone erosions are seen in the case of CSOM. So this pathway leading to complication is more common in CSOM. Thrombophlebitis. Now when bacteria invade, and then in that case the surrounding vein or the artery undergoes inflammation, and that leads to thrombophlebitis of the vein. Now this condition is also more common in the case of ASOM or ANOM. So we talked about three causes and the disease which are more common in those cases. Now let's try to understand what are the complications. So there can either be extracranial complication or there can be an intracranial complication. In this video we are going to talk about extracranial complication. Now extracranial complication involve the temporal bone. Let's try to understand with this schematic diagram. So this diagram is a schematic diagram showing you this as the medial wall of middle ear, this as the posterior wall of middle ear. This, though drawn larger, is the mastoid behind the posterior wall of middle ear. This is the adductus that must be connecting middle ear cavity to the mastoid antrum, and we have tried to draw from the mast. Okay, so this part, then we will discuss what else we need to know. So this is the middle ear cavity. We will try to understand where the infection can reach from this middle ear cavity. Either from this middle ear cavity, the infection can go posteriorly. So when it goes posteriorly, it will lead to mastoiditis. So the first extracranial complication is mastoiditis. The second thing is that from this middle ear, can go through the fallopian canal into the facial nerve, that can lead to facial nerve palsy. So the second complication is facial nerve palsy. Okay, the third complication is that through the mastoid cavity the infection can also go to petrous part of the temporal bone, and it may reach up to the petrous apex. So the third complication is petrositis. Okay, and the fourth complication is through the medial wall of middle ear, the infection can go into the inner ear. So we land up with four complications, four extracranial complications, that is mastoiditis, the facial nerve palsy, the petrositis, and inner ear infection, that is labyrinthitis. So we will start discussing with acute mastoiditis. Now this acute mastoiditis is the most common extracranial complication seen in the case of CSOM, or it is the most common intratemporal complication. Now the most common cause for acute mastoiditis is streptococcus pneumoniae. Let's try to understand what happens in this case, and this is going to be really very important. So this is our medial wall of middle ear that we have tried to draw, and this is the posterior wall. Okay, now we will try to draw mastoid from here. So this part is the mastoid. Okay, so this is the medial wall of middle ear, the posterior wall of the middle ear, and this is the mastoid. And here must be the adductus, that is an opening connecting the mastoid cavity to the middle ear cavity. And say this is the eustachian tube from the anterior wall of the middle ear that connects the middle ear cavity to the nasopharynx. So, so now let's consider that there is an eustachian tube blockade due to infection. Now this will lead to a tubal blockade as in the case of ASOM, and finally there will be hyperemia and suppuration within the middle ear. Okay, uh, so here we are talking about ASOM. Okay, so as in the case of FASOM, tubal blockade leading to a pre-suppuration stage, hyperemia, the cartwheel appearance of tympanic membrane, the lighthouse sign that we see, the discharge. Okay, this all is seen. What can happen is that instead of resolution in the case of ASOM, if the bacteria is more virulent or the person is immunodeficient, this infection may travel through the editors into the mastoid cavity. Now we all know that mastoid cavity is filled up with mastoid air cells. So these are our mastoid air cells. Okay, it is completely filled with mastoid air cells, with largest cell being mastoid antrum. Now what will happen is that as the infection reaches mastoid cavity from the middle ear infection, the mastoid air cells will also undergo hyperemia. Okay, and they will finally, the mastoid air cells will be filled with pus and hyperemia due to infection has already reached there. Now because of this infection and inflammation that is occurring, the editus is uh, temporarily blocked, and the mucosal lining of mastoid is also swelled up. Due to this, there is venous congestion within, and this leads to a local acidosis within mastoid cavity. This local acidosis leads to decalcification within the mastoid cavity. The septas, that bony septas that separate these mastoid cells, are broken down, and finally this whole cavity is converted into a single cavity filled with pus. Okay, this is what happens in the case of acute mastoiditis following. So finally, after a blockade and middle ear infection, the mastoid air cells were infected, followed by hyperemic decalcification, leading to breaking of septas between the mastoid air cell, and finally the mastoid cavity was a single cavity filled with pus, also known as coalescent mastoiditis. Okay, so this is what is acute mastoiditis. Now let's try to understand clinical feature that we see in the case of acute mastoiditis. So the first thing is that when patient will present with acute mastoiditis, we will see a clinical feature as this. Means, as you are seeing in the image, the air will be pulled forward laterally and downward. This is because of the edema and the inflammation that is occurring within the mastoid. The air is pulled forward. The second thing is that in the post-auricular surface there will be edema and redness, and on examination we will see uh, ironed out appearance of mastoid. This is because of the edema overlying this post-auricular skin surface. The third thing is that we will see a reservoir sign. Now this is very important, that on examination when we remove the discharge from the external auditory canal, the external auditory canal is soon again filled up by the discharge. This is because the discharge is coming continuously from the mastoid, and it is not just present in the middle ear. So as much we clear it from the middle ear, it goes on filling from the mastoid. The fourth thing is sagging up of posterior superior meatal wall. Since we know that the posterior wall of the middle ear and the mastoid anterior wall are common, and this mastoid wall also forms a deep part of external auditory canal. So when there occurs inflammation of mastoid pushing the wall of the mastoid forward, the deep part of the external auditory canal posterior wall is also pulled forward, because it is a part that that is common wall for the mastoid. Also the lighthouse sign can be seen, as it is the feature of ASOM. Okay, Now we will try to understand what actually can be the complication in the acute mastoiditis. So with this diagram we will again try to understand how an acute mastoiditis infection can spread. So acute mastoiditis infection can spread superiorly. Near to this we have root of zygoma. So this is the root of zygoma. So this infection superiorly can spread to zygomatic bone, leading to zygomatic bone abscess. Okay. Posteriorly, the lead to post-auricular abscess, means behind the ear where there was already inflammation and ironed out appearance, it leads to a post-auricular abscess or a subperiosteal abscess. And this complication of post-auricular abscess is the most common complication that occurs in the case of mastoiditis. The third thing is that it can spread anteriorly, involving the external auditory canal, and when this abscess involves external auditory canal, it is known as Luke's abscess. The fourth thing is it can spread inferiorly. Now from the mastoid tip arises the two muscle origin, that is sternocleidomastoid and posterior belly of digastric. So when the infection abscess travels through the sternocleidomastoid, it is known as Bizold abscess. And when it travels through the posterior belly of digastric, it is known as Sittelli's abscess. So this is how an acute mastoiditis may spread. It may spread superiorly causing the zygomatic abscess, posteriorly causing the postauricular or the subperiosteal abscess, that is the most common complication of acute mastoiditis. Anteriorly, it as the again we are focusing on this, that anteriorly the posterior wall of the middle ear also forms the deep part of posterior wall of external auditory canal. So when this is infected, it may also involve the it can also involve the external auditory canal. So pus will travel out there. This is known as Luke's abscess. Inferiorly, this may travel through the sternocleidomastoid or posterior belly of digastric. When through sternocleidomastoid, it is Bizold, and when through posterior belly of digastric, it is Sittelli's abscess. So this is what we needed to know about acute mastoiditis. In this condition, we'll now talk about how we go on for it. So now let's talk about investigation for diagnosing the case of acute mastoiditis. We go for a CT scan and we see clouding up of the hair cells. Later on, when all hair cells are destroyed, we see a cavity, a single cavity in the mastoid. Okay, a single cavity will be seen. Management is that we give off IV antibiotics, and wherever there is pus we have to drain it, as we know. When there is no response in 48 hours of antibiotic treatment, we go for cortical mastoidectomy for removing the disease from mastoid. Now let's talk about the second complication that can occur as extracranial complication, that is labyrinthitis. Okay, so this labyrinthitis can be of three types, either circumscribed, diffuse serous type, or diffuse suppurative type. The circumscribed is when there is only a segment of the inner ear. Say this is the inner ear. Okay, just it is for understanding purpose only. This is inner ear, so only a part of the inner ear is involved. This condition is seen when the infection travels through lateral semicircular canal. In that case, only a part of membranous labyrinth is involved. The patient will present with sensory neural hearing loss, plus there will be vertigo. The treatment is, for treating vertigo, we will give labyrinthine sedative, but in this case also, since it is due to lateral semicircular canal perforation, we can go for fistula closure, and then we will go for mastoid exploration for observing the disease spread. The second type is diffuse serous labyrinthitis. This occurs because of toxins. Means there is no perforation within this wall, the medial wall, but the toxins of the bacteria travel either through the lateral semicircular canal, oval window, or round window within the inner ear, causing a labyrinthitis that contains sterile fluid, that is serous, means it is not infective. Since this condition is not infective because of serous fluid, it leads to an irritative condition, and this is why in this condition we see a ipsilateral nystagmus. This is a differentiating feature from the diffuse suppurative type where there is complete destruction of the inner ear, leading to a type of contralateral nystagmus. Other features of vertigo and sensory neural hearing loss will be kind of similar in these two. The third condition is facial nerve palsy. And now this is very easy. Let's consider this the posterior wall, and this is the mastoid segment that is running through the posterior wall. Okay, and this is our medial wall. Now this was the part of facial nerve, that is the horizontal part. Now this facial nerve is running within this fallopian canal, that is a bony canal. Now this bony canal has a dehiscence here, and this is the most common location of dehiscence in the facial fallopian canal, that is above the oval window. And this dehiscence is found in 50% of population. So in conditions where there is fluid accumulation within the middle ear, this fluid will compress onto this dehiscence, leading to compression of facial nerve that will lead to a facial nerve palsy. The fourth complication is petrositis, means there was already mastoiditis, okay, and the hyperemia was already there within the mastoid, and this traveled in the petrous part of temporal bone. Now we need to understand this complication does not occur in everyone. There is only 30% of population that has air cells within the petrous part of temporal bone, and this occurs in these individuals where the infection from mastoid, that is hyperemia suppuration, and the pus-filled mastoid, the infection travels within the petrous part of temporal bone, leading to same thing, the hyperemia suppuration of the cells within the petrous part of temporal bone. Finally, there is a pus-filled petrous, and in the apex of petrous part of temporal bone, the two main nerve travels, the fifth nerve and the sixth nerve, and the clinical feature are related to these two nerves. The fifth nerve palsy will lead to pain within the distribution of trigeminal nerve, especially the orbital, means there will be a retroorbital pain, an area of the face involving the trigeminal nerve. The sixth nerve involvement will lead to diplopia due to paralysis of lateral rectus muscle. And here in the case of petrositis, we have a triad that is known as Grady-Negos triad, means a fifth nerve palsy or involvement leading to a retroorbital pain and pain in distribution of face, the sixth nerve palsy leading to a late diplopia due to lateral rectus palsy, and a persistent air discharge. This is what were extracranial complications. Okay, the four extracranial complication that we discussed were mastoiditis, petrositis, the labyrinthitis, and facial nerve palsy. Thanks for watching.